Hey class, in this video I'm going to talk to you about the Sunny 16 rule. The Sunny 16 rule is a concept which involves coming up with an exposure for your scene during daylight hours without the use of your camera's meter. And the way to determine the exposure is mainly based on the ISO that you're using and observation of the light and the shadow in your scene. And when you come up with an exposure, this is what's called your BDE, or the basic daylight exposure. So let me get into this presentation here, which is available also in the modules. So once again, the Sunny 16 rule is a method of creating a photograph without using your camera's meter. This involves creating what's known as, or determining what is the basic daylight exposure, or the BDE, which is the proper exposure of the scene during daylight hours. So how do we come up with this basic daylight exposure? It's actually pretty simple. It only involves two steps, but there are some assumptions before we get into those two steps. The assumptions are, one, you're in manual mode, which you should be already on your camera, manual exposure mode. Okay. Two is that photographing the scenes are happening during daylight hours, and daylight hours are between 2 hours after sunrise and 2 hours before sunset. So for example, if sunrise at 7 a.m., that would mean you would want to start shooting 2 hours after that, so 9 a.m., and then 2 hours before sunset. Let's say sunset is at 6 p.m., you want to stop shooting before 4 p.m. So the Sunny 16 rule applies to the strongest, during the day where the light is the strongest, which would be between 2 hours after sunrise and 2 hours before sunset. This would be probably 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Depending on the time of year, it'll also obviously change from summer to winter. Okay. And an important thing is that when you're photographing a scene, the sun is behind you. Okay, the Sunny 16 rule will not work if you are shooting against the sun. So with all these assumptions, when you go out and photograph during normal daylight hours, the Sunny 16 rule will apply, and you won't have to use your camera's meter. So how does this actually work? How do you determine the basic daylight exposure? It's basically two steps. The first step is determining your shutter speed. So the shutter speed is a real simple formula. It's 1 over the ISO. When you turn your DSLR on, you're going to have already an ISO selected. Okay, that's what's going to happen automatically. Whatever you're using prior to the last time you used the camera, that's the ISO that comes on your camera. You can always change that ISO. So let's say, for example, you set your ISO to 200. So step one, determine your shutter speed. The shutter speed is 1 over your ISO. So your shutter is 1 over 200. Okay, pretty simple. Then step two involves you determining what your aperture is. What is your f-stop? Okay. The way to determine what your f-stop is to actually observe with your eyes what the lighting condition is. Specifically, what are the shadows doing, if there are even any shadows. Okay. So here is the chart. If your lighting condition is sunny on a cloudless day and you're at the beach or you're at an area where there's snow, your shadows are going to be very harsh, right? So if that is your situation, then your f-stop is f22. Again, the assumptions are you're shooting in manual mode, you're photographing during the strongest light during the day, and the sun is behind you. Okay. You take the picture, and that's it. Okay, going down the line here, if you're not at this beach or you're not at the snow and it's it's still sunny and cloudless. Your shadows are going to be similar, still going to be pretty sharp. Then your f-stop would be f16. Now you take the picture. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back here. If it's a partly cloudy day, right, the sun's coming in and out of the clouds, but it's still mostly sunny, but there's still some clouds. Your shadows may have some soft edges around it. If that's the situation, then you put it to f11. Okay, starting to be a little bit more cloudy, shadows become soft, then f8. Heavy overcast, then you go 5.6. Notice what's happening is that the f-stop is lowering in number, but the actual opening is getting larger. Okay, based on that aperture chart that was on the previous module. The smaller the f-stop number, the bigger the opening. So what's happening here, it's getting darker and darker. If you think about what's happening, we're getting a cloudless day to a partly cloudy to cloudy and then heavy overcast. The lens is opening up. So it's allowing more light in because it's actually darker, right? So if it's heavy overcast, the shadows are going to be minimal to none, and then you'd be at 5.6, you take the picture. If you're in what's called an open shade situation, or it's during sunset, and again, you're not facing the sun's behind you, okay, that would be an f4. You take the picture. What is open shade? I wanted to discuss this because this is going to be something that you could look for when you're shooting, let's say, for example, portraits. This is actually an ideal situation to photograph portraits. Open shade is where the subject is in a shaded area, but the sky is open and it's not closed. You don't have a roof over your head. You're not under a tree. You're in a shaded area, but there's open sky above you. Okay, you're not in a garage or a patio either. So here, look at this very scientific diagram, and email me if it's too complicated for you to understand. But here is a diagram of open shade. You have a building here, and you have the sun at an angle behind this building, and this building, the way it's positioned in relation to the sun, is casting a shadow in an area here. This area that's shaded with no roof above, no trees, no awning, no nothing, this is considered open shade because if you were to stand here and look up, you have open sky, but you're still in a shaded area. So the sun is behind the building, your subject is in front of that building, and that subject is in the shaded area. Now think about what time of day this would be possible, or what time of day this would not be possible. Okay, like let's say noon. If this was noon, the sun would be straight up here. You would have very little shadow to work with. So if you're looking for an open shade area, which would be ideal for portraits, which is a later assignment, this is something you want to look for. And most likely you'd see this mid-afternoon or earlier part of the morning, right? Because the sun has to be at a certain angle. Okay, that's open shade. And this would be f4 according to the chart. Okay. So let's do an example real quick. Example 1. It's a bright, cloudless day. You are in a park in Los Angeles. Your ISO is 100. Let's go back to the steps to determining your basic daylight exposure. Okay, step 1 is, what is your shutter speed? Okay, so if your ISO is 100 and the formula says 1 over the ISO, then your shutter should be 1 over 100. Okay. Step 2, what is your f-stop based upon location, shadow, and light quality? Well, the clues here are it's bright and cloudless day, right? So according to that chart, it would be f16. We're at a park, we're not at the beach or in the snow, so it would be f16. Okay. So that's your exposure, your ISO 100, your shutter is 1 over 100, and then you'd be f16. And assuming the sun is behind you, right, you're not shooting against the sun, and you're shooting during normal daylight hours, this would be your exposure. You'd focus and take the picture without even having to use the meter. Okay. The basic daylight exposure is ISO 100, 1/100 shutter speed at f16 for this example number 1. Now, it just so happened this turned out to be f16, and the rule is called Sunny 16. It doesn't mean you're supposed to be shooting in f16 all the time. All right, let's take a look at the next example. Example 2. It's a winter day in Chicago, and if anyone has ever been to Chicago on a winter day, it is very unlike Los Angeles. Let's just put it that way. Snow, it's heavy cloud coverage, and you cannot see the sun. Your ISO is 400. Okay, so what is your basic daylight exposure? How do you expose for the scene using the Sunny 16 rule when it's not even sunny? So what is your shutter? The shutter is going to be 1 over your ISO. Your ISO is given as 400, so it's 1 over 400. That's your shutter. Now, step 2, what is your f-stop? Based upon the clues in this example and the shadow and light. Well, it's heavy cloud coverage. You don't even see the sun. There's probably very little to no shadow in the scene. Okay? So that could be 5.6. You focus, take the picture. Okay? These are estimates of coming up with your basic daylight exposure. Of course, you take the picture, and you may have to adjust your f-stop accordingly. But these are good starting points for you. Okay? So the basic daylight exposure for this example would be ISO 400. 1 over 400 is your shutter at f5.6 f-stop. Okay, finally, let's do one more example. It's a cloudy day, but you can see some faint shadows. Your ISO is 200. What is your exposure based on the Sunny 16 rule? Step 1, determine your shutter. Shutter is 1 over ISO, so it's be 1 over 200. Step 2, determine the f-stop based upon your observation. It's cloudy, but you can see some faint shadows. So is it, maybe it's not quite partly cloudy, but it's powerful. It's the sun's powerful enough to kind of give you some faint shadows. So maybe it's f8. Okay, based upon that chart, cloudy day, faint shadows. Okay, it isn't completely shadowless, so that's telling us that there is some brightness to the situation. So it's not a 5.6 day; it's an f8 day. Okay, focus, take the picture. All right, the BDE, the basic daylight exposure for this example is ISO 200, 1 over 200, shutter speed at f8. Okay. Let's talk about a second about equivalencies. In the previous module, I had you do some equivalencies with a camera simulator and try to figure out what equivalencies would be. Equivalencies, as a review, is another way at arriving at the same exposure with a different combination of your f-stop and your shutter speed and even possibly your ISO. The equivalencies are going to have the same exposure, meaning that they're the same level of brightness, but you're using a different combination to get to the same level of brightness. So let's take a look at how that works with Sunny 16 rule. So let's say you photograph a scene during a partly cloudy day. The sun is definitely out, but there are some clouds partially covering it. You set your ISO to ISO 200. So let's determine your basic daylight exposure. Step 1, what is your shutter? It's 1 over the ISO, so it's 1 over 200. Step 2, what is your f-stop? It's a partly cloudy day. The sun is definitely out, but there are some clouds maybe partially covering it. So based upon that chart, that'd be f11. Okay, it's not quite f16. It's f11, partly cloudy. Your basic daylight exposure, your BDE, is ISO 200, 1/200 shutter at f11. Right? But let's say you didn't want to shoot at f11. What if you wanted to shoot with a more shallow depth of field? Remember, so back in the last module talking about depth of field, a shallower depth of field means the f-stop number is going to be smaller. And what that means is that it's shallower depth of field, that means less things will be in focus. Hence, shallow depth of field. Okay, lower number, but in reality, the lens opening is getting bigger. Okay, allowing more light in. But you want the equivalency of that. What would be your basic daylight exposure if you wanted to use 5.6 in that situation that you just determined the BDE to be at f11, right, at 1/200 shutter speed. Right. So let's say, go back to that example, the ISO was the same, 200. We determined that it was a partly cloudy day, so our basic daylight exposure was at first 1/200 at f11. Okay, that's what we determined using the chart. Then we want to go eventually to 5.6, but we'll open up one stop. From f11, we'll open up the lens one stop from f11 to f8. So if we change the aperture to f11, what would be the shutter? We can't just leave it at 1/200, right? We're already changing the f-stop here. We're making the lens opening larger. We're allowing more light in. So we have to do something to balance this out so it's still an equivalency. We want the same level of brightness. Okay? We can't just leave it at 1/200. If we left it at 1/200, because we opened up the lens larger, we would get what's called an overexposed shot. It'd be too bright. But we don't want that. We want the same level of brightness. So what shutter would this be? If you guessed to make the shutter faster, then you're correct. We'd go one stop faster, 1/400. Okay, notice that we basically doubled the time of the shutter to make it faster. But we wanted to be at 5.6. So we're going to open up the lens even more by one stop, making it brighter again. But we can't leave it at 1/400 because that would make this 1/400 works with f8. But if we opened up the lens to 5.6, we can't just leave it there. Right? We want the same brightness. We want the equivalency. So what would be the shutter? Look at this pattern. We kind of doubled the time, made it faster from 1/200 to 1/400. This would be 1/800, a much faster shutter speed. Notice the shutter is getting faster as we open up the lens. Once again, from f11 to f8, we're opening it up one stop. From f8 to 5.6, we opened it up another stop. More light is coming in. So we have to balance that out with the equivalency on the shutter side by making it faster so we allow less light in, right? To balance it out. We want the same brightness. So we went from 1/200, 1/400 at f8, and then finally 1/800 at 5.6. So these are all equivalencies. If you shot the same scene at 1/400 at f8, it would be the same level of brightness as this exposure. And then if you shot it at 5.6 at 1/800, it'd be the same level of brightness. But what would be different about all these shots? The brightness would be the same in theory, but something fundamentally would look a little different in each of these shots. What would that be? The clue is in the shallow depth of field. So we would have less things in focus. Maybe you focus on some object in the foreground, and then everything behind it would be blurred out. Okay, this is a review from your previous assignment where you were doing depth of field, right? Okay. So the rest of these slides are going to be available to you in this module for you to review. But that covers the Sunny 16 rule. That's it.